It's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote presentation, Can Agriculture Save the Planet Before It Destroys It? Jack Bobo serves as the Senior Vice President and Chief Communications Officer for Intrexon, a synthetic biology company developing revolutionary solutions to the world's most pressing problems in food, energy, and health. In 2015, he was named by Scientific American one of the 100 most influential people in biotechnology today. He previously worked for the U.S. Department of State as a senior advisor on global food policy, biotechnology, and agricultural trade. Prior to his distinguished career at the U.S. Department of State, he was an attorney at Crowell and Moring, LLP. He received his JD, MS in Environmental Science, BA in Psychology and Chemistry, and a BS in Biology from Indiana University. Please help me welcome Jack Bobo to the stage.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here, and don't be too impressed with the 5 degrees. My wife has a PhD in molecular biology, and so I'm all about quantity and she's about quality. And I suspect in this room the PhDs would get the nod. I am excited to be here. I'm excited for a lot of reasons. Before I really begin the official comments, though, I think that we need to acknowledge that we're in a social age. For the millennials in the audience, I know that attention spans can be short, so the answer to the question, can agriculture save the planet? Yes. You have to stick around for the conclusion, which is will it? So I'm pulling out my phone here. We're going to go live on Twitter, and hopefully you guys can follow and tweet and retweet what all of the rest of the people in the audience are hopefully doing, assuming it's fairly positive about me. So when I'm going to count to 3, and then I want everybody to give a go plant health. Can you guys do that for me? And we are live. Can I get 1, 2, 3? Go plant health. All right. Thanks, everybody. Okay. So I spent 13 years at the U.S. Department of State before I joined this company. And I got to travel around the world, and the first question I always got was, I thought we invited USDA, not the State Department. That was a little discouraging. The second question I would get is, well, what's the difference between what they do at the State Department and what they do at USDA? I'd say that's easy. At the State Department, well, at USDA they do things. At the State Department we talk about doing things. And of course that's why I'm here today. So the topic, though, is can agriculture save the planet before it destroys it? And I know that's a little bit provocative for a group like this, but in many ways there's nothing we do that has a bigger, more negative impact on the planet than agriculture, and yet there's nothing more critical for our survival. So the challenge we all have is to maintain and grow those benefits and to decrease the negatives. And obviously that's what you do every day. If we were to talk about, well, before I begin, I actually want to explain, how many people in the room know what Intrexon is? Have you heard of it? Okay, there are 1,000 people here, and I think 10 hands are up. That's depressing because I'm head of communications for the company. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds on who we are. Have you heard of the genetically engineered salmon, the fast-growing aquabounty salmon? We're a majority, that's a majority-owned subsidiary. We had our first sales into Canada on Friday. Have you heard of the non-browning Arctic apple? That's us too. Good, a lot of people here. Transova, livestock genetics. You guys are plant guys, so maybe not. What about the genetically engineered mosquitoes fighting Aedes? That's us too. So you have heard of Intrexon. That's the last I'm going to really be talking about Intrexon. So if we were to talk about land, though, 40% of all the land on Earth that could be used for agriculture is being used for agriculture today. The amount of cropland is the size of South America, the amount of pasture land the size of Africa. So in terms of land, there's nothing bigger than agriculture, and the footprint is as big, if not bigger, than we'd all want it to be. If we were to talk about water, this is the Aral Sea back in 1973. And if you fast forward to today, it's no longer really a sea at all, and that's because of agricultural withdrawals of water. Now, these are not just the problems of 2050, and they're not just the problems of other places. This is the Colorado River, the fifth largest river in America. It no longer flows to the sea. These are the realities of today. If we were to talk about climate change, 10 to 15% of all greenhouse gases come from agriculture. Another 10 to 15% come from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. That's nearly as much as energy, and it's more than anything else. And yet 90% of what we read in the newspaper is about energy policy, virtually nothing about food policy. And yet, for every dollar you invest in wind and solar, you get less than $1 back because they're less efficient than fossil fuels. Now, those are critical, long-term investments for our future. But for every dollar you invest in agriculture, you get $1.43 back everywhere in the world. Positive rates of return. So you have to wonder, would consumers rather pay more for their energy or less for their food to get a cleaner environment? Now, from what I know of most Americans, they'd rather eat their way to a cleaner environment. I can say that now because I don't work for the government. So how do we get people to care more about the work you do? Now, you know we're going from 7 billion people to 9.5 billion people by 2050. That's a challenge. But there are also a challenge in terms of population. We have 800 million people who will go to bed tonight hungry. 9 million people die every year of hunger. That's more than HIV, road accidents, malaria. Add all those things up and it's still less than hunger. And yet how many headlines does it get? 9 million is a very big number. It's hard for people to wrap their minds around. So that's 25,000 people will die today of hunger. That's 1,000 people over the next hour. That's one person every 4 seconds. How do we turn that 9 million that's a statistic into that one person, which is a tragedy, so that people understand the importance of the work you do? Now, we need between 60 and 100% more food by 2050, and we need to do it with less land, less water, fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to do everything better tomorrow than we're doing it today, and our rivers and lakes are already going dry. That is a challenge. I have no doubt that innovation can solve the problems of agriculture. Look at where we've come from. Everybody wants to start with today when they talk about the problems of agriculture, but we need to start from where we've come from. If you go back to 1980 and you look at the resources that were used to produce a bushel of corn, there were 35% fewer greenhouse gases today than back then. 40% less land to produce that bushel, 40% less energy, 50% less water, and 60% less soil erosion. Farmers are doing everything better today than they were doing back then. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't problems with agriculture, but that means that things are getting better. They're just not getting better fast enough. And yet the story people tell is that agriculture is getting worse. How do we get people to understand how far we've come and understand how far we still have to go? Farmers are the solution, not the problem. Now, we have these competing worldviews. On one hand, you have a slow food movement that says that we should be producing food the way it was produced 100 years ago. And there are those who think we need more intensive agriculture, higher tech. And these are two important global trends. But in many ways, they're running headlong into each other. Because if you can choose what goes on your local label, how do you trade it globally? So how do we get these two trends in sync with each other so that they're going to the same place? Because the challenges are that great. Now, in many ways, people have never cared more nor known less how their food is produced. That's also a challenge. Because if people don't know how food is produced and yet they care about the issue, they're asking for changes to a food system they don't necessarily understand, and that could cause as many problems as it solves. I like to say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And there is no place that people despise change more than in the food they eat. Food is what brings us together as family, as friends. And if you mess with my food, you're messing with my family. And people don't like that. So it's not surprising that it creates strong feelings. But if we don't change how we produce food, everything will change. It's also about choices and consequences. Over the next decade, Europe will slightly decrease the amount of cropland it uses, and it will slightly increase the amount of food it produces. On the other hand, Brazil is greatly increasing its food production and the land that's going into it. Now, it's not because Brazilians are eating that much more and Europeans are eating that much less, because Brazil is the #1 country for exporting food to Europe. And Europe's #1 export country spending at food is Brazil. So Europe has exported the environmental footprint of agriculture to arguably the most biodiverse country on the planet. That might not be a good idea. It's about choices and consequences. Europeans can choose not to grow food, and they can choose to buy it somewhere else, but that food brings with it consequences as well. Choices and consequences. I want to return to that from time to time over this talk. Now, we also want to look at how do companies talk about their products. Why is it that people don't necessarily understand the science of the products they're eating or drinking? So here, if you look at this label and the things that it doesn't have, this is non-GMO water. You can imagine when the marketing guys found out that water wasn't GMO. They're like, we could own that market. So they're selling somebody something that they know isn't any better than the other product. And the feeling is, well, you know, consumer doesn't know. So when the consumer has a false belief, it's more often in the interest of industry to cater to that belief than to try to eradicate it. And that's unfortunate because it undermines faith and confidence in the food system. Another way of looking at this is that how we market agriculture today. You see these beautiful farms on these packages where the animals are happy as they're sent to slaughter. Now, this is dog food. And I'm not sure that dogs really care what the farms look like. But we're marketing a reality or a view of agriculture that's not necessarily consistent with the reality of agriculture. And then we complain that people don't know how their food is produced. Well, if you don't tell them, how are they supposed to know? So the food industry bears a lot of responsibility for the consumer attitudes towards the industry. And it leads to skepticism about our food system. And that's also a challenge. Because there's really no failure to innovate in agriculture. There's a failure to communicate, or to communicate the wrong things. Now, when I was at the State Department, I used to spend a lot of time talking about science because I really like science. But over time, I found that it didn't really work as well as I would have liked. I used to talk a lot about risk. And I would explain that hazard times exposure equals risk. I'm sure you've all heard this. And then I try to explain to people what risk is, because we're hardwired to understand hazards. We're not hardwired to understand risk. So I would give an example that plane crash, that's a pretty big hazard, but your exposure is low or you wouldn't be here. On the other hand, a car crash, the hazard is smaller, but the exposure is greater, and that's why they sometimes say it's more dangerous to drive than to fly. Again, hardwired to understand hazards, not risk. They worry about flight, you're not worrying about driving. So what are we going to do? Well, eventually I realized that it's not hazard times exposure equals risk that I should be talking about. It's hazard times media exposure equals perception of risk. And it's that perception of risk that we're dealing with, not risk itself. This is what I call the tweetification of risk. Because somebody tweets some idea about some chemical in their bread that comes from yoga mats, and all of a sudden it goes to 1,000 people, then 100,000, then 1 million, and it's all around the world, and all of a sudden chemicals or products are being pulled from products. There are serious repercussions to these issues because it moves so quickly. And if we're not part of that conversation, we can't really be surprised about the outcomes. Now, when to communicate, governments are pretty good about understanding when the risk is high and media exposure is low, like during flu season, that we need to get out there and talk about it. But what about when the risk is low and media attention is high? Well, to a lot of government officials, that's not a real risk. But if people think it's a risk, and they take actions because they think it's a risk, and they ask for policy changes because they believe it's a risk, well, I guarantee you that becomes a risk. And so we need to be part of the conversation. Figuring out what to communicate, this is pretty disappointing, because if you had asked me when I was in the government, what are my talking points, I would have talked about, well, the amount is minuscule, research shows it's safe, we're going to feed the world. Well, research tells us that these are all topics that turn people off. That's pretty depressing. Science, if you lead with science, you will lose with science. I know, again, pretty disappointing for this audience. Science, at the beginning of a conversation, only polarizes the audience. Those who agree with you more, and those who disagree with you more. Again, pretty disappointing. Trying to understand how people think about risk. So on the top here, we have things that people worry about, terrorist attacks and other things. And then on the bottom, you have things they probably should worry about. And you can see there's not that much of a correlation between what we worry about and what we should worry about, but there's a huge correlation between what we worry about and what we read about in the newspaper or watch on TV or the internet. People worry about what they're told to worry about. How could it be any different? Why would you worry about things you're not hearing about? Why wouldn't you worry about things that you are hearing about? This isn't what other people do, this is the way we all do it. And then we act upon those feelings. So if you look at where people donate their money, on the left is the amount of money that's generated or received by different organizations and foundations for different causes. And then on the right are the things that kill us. Now, one might expect that there would be a huge correlation between where we give our money and the things that kill us, but of course there's not. There's a correlation between the things that we hear about and the things that we give our money to. If nobody comes to your door and knocks and asks for a donation, why would you give something? We worry about the things we hear about. How could it be any different? And that's a challenge, because we need to find a way of demystifying food science. We need to make it exciting and not scary. Our food and science don't have to be scary. Now, this is not my daughter, but it could be. She's not the most adventurous eater in the world. And I was giving this talk in Milan a couple years ago, and she was sitting in the audience, and she said, "You don't say that when I'm not here, do you?" And I said, "No." Because she couldn't be bothered to watch my presentations on the internet anyway. She's too busy. So how do we do that? So I'm going to give you guys a little quiz, and this audience is pretty sophisticated. How many of you in the room have eaten a Chinese gooseberry? It's pretty good, maybe 10% or so. I am a little bit disappointed that you haven't had the kiwi fruit. I highly recommend it. How we talk about things matters, though, right? Because when it's a Chinese gooseberry, it is a hairy fruit. And when it is a kiwi, it is cute and fuzzy. Now, imagine back in 1910, some intrepid Kiwi went to China, found the Chinese gooseberry, brought it back to New Zealand, created a new variety, and, most importantly, rebranded it. The rest is history. How we talk about things matters. Now, you may have heard of this idea, if a third grader or a fifth grader can't pronounce it, you shouldn't put it in your mouth. That's pretty depressing, and you could explain the science of why that's crazy, and you can beat people up with science, or you can lead them to knowledge. You can show them this image and all the chemicals that make up the kiwi fruit, the banana, the egg, and they will smile and they will laugh and they will get it. I found that it's much better to lead people to knowledge than to beat them up with science. And yet, how often when we read about things that don't make any sense, we just want to beat people up? We don't recognize that we have those same concerns about issues that we're not experts in. So sometimes people will ask me, what's the scariest food you know? And I always say, the seedless watermelon. Unless I'm speaking to the seedless watermelon people, then I use a different example. Don't need any more hate mail from seedless watermelon people. So, you have to wonder, where do seedless watermelons come from? They don't have any seeds. It kind of blows your mind. So I did a little research on the internet, so I'm pretty sure it's true. And it turns out you start with a regular watermelon, which has 2 sets of chromosomes. I know, people are like, 2? I didn't know it had any. And you expose it to a natural plant extract, which is highly toxic and mutagenic. I added the skull and crossbones so you'll be more concerned. And you end up with a watermelon with 4 sets of chromosomes, which is twice as bad. But that's okay, it still produces seeds. And then you cross that back with the original watermelon, and you end up with a watermelon with 3 sets of chromosomes, which is so screwed up it does not produce any seeds. And that's the one you eat. No nutritional analysis, no food safety evaluation. This is conventional breeding. Now, if somebody were saying seedless watermelons produced through mutagenesis, that might actually bother people. It has 3 sets of chromosomes. Oh my God, I didn't know it had any. So, of course, there is nobody out there saying that, and I'm not trying to convince you to stop eating seedless watermelons again. I don't need any hate mail from the seedless watermelon people. They're wonderful. The point is that we worry about things that we're told to worry about. And a perfectly good story could be made about worrying about this. We need to figure out ways of telling stories that get people laughing and engaged and don't scare them or don't speak down to them. Now, one thing I want you to leave this room understanding is that our brains are lying to us all the time. You cannot trust your brain. And I'm going to give you some examples. Now, we have a fast-thinking and a slow-thinking part of our brain. Now, when you look at this, how many of you think the square on the top is darker? Can I see some hands? Okay. And how many of you think the square on the bottom is darker? Not too many hands. Okay. Well, what we actually have here is a visual illusion. The colors are actually the same. I can prove it. Now, the problem is that our brain looks at this and it believes that the light is coming from the top, and because it's angled up, it must be darker in order to appear a certain shade. And the one on the bottom, our brain recognizes must be in shadow, so must actually be lighter than it's perceived. And so our brain is actually adjusting for what we see and lying to us in this particular situation. Now, it doesn't matter how long you look at it. You can understand that the colors are the same, but you can't see them in the same way. So this is an optical illusion. We're all fine with optical illusions. They don't make us bad people. But our brain is lying to us in other ways as well. Now, this is the bat and the ball problem. Some of you have probably heard it. So I'm going to give you guys a math problem. Any 5th grader could get it right. Only 80% of you will get it wrong. That's okay. The smarter you are, the more likely you are to get it wrong. I just want you to shout out the first answer that comes to mind. Okay, here we go. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Answer? I heard some 10 cents and maybe some 5 cents. You guys are a little bit nervous since I just told you I was setting you up. You guys are pretty sharp. So I'm going to do the math. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. If the bat costs 10 cents, or if the ball costs 10 cents and $1 more, that's 110, that's 120, that doesn't work. If the ball costs 5 cents, the bat costs $1 more, which is $1.05, $1.05 plus 5. Okay, we can all do the math. But remember, we've got that fast and slow thinking part of our brain. And that slow thinking part of our brain is the one that does math. And it's lazy. And if it thinks that other part of its brain that doesn't do math is right, it's going to be like, that's fine, 10 cents. It's not going to go back and double check, I guarantee it. And that's how we go through our days, with that fast thinking part of our brain giving us answers to questions it has no legitimate right to answer. And we're never fact checking ourselves. And that's part of the problem. It's not something other people do, it's something we all do. It's human nature. It's how we get through our day without doing so much math. So how does this impact food? Well, one is through confirmation bias, the idea that we seek out information that is consistent with what we believe and we avoid information that's not. Now again, we're comfortable with the idea that other people have confirmation bias. We're slightly less comfortable with the idea that we are biased. So I'm going to give you an example of my own bias. If I were to read a newspaper article that said there was a research study that found that organic agriculture was more nutritious than conventional agriculture, what would I do? I'd ask, who are the authors? Who funded the research? What was the methodology? Those are all pretty reasonable things to do. Now, let's say I read an article about research that said organic agriculture is no more nutritious than conventional agriculture. What would I do? I'd tweet it, right? I don't need to check the authors. Methodology is just fine. That's what confirmation bias looks like. It's not people ignoring information that they absolutely have to believe. It's we dig deeper, we search harder to disprove things we don't agree with. And you will always find something in any article that allows you to dismiss it. We need to understand our own biases before we can begin to talk to others about theirs. Now, another element from psychology is the availability heuristic. It just says that how easily do things come to mind? So if I say the word natural, what words come to mind? Rainbows, butterflies, Ebola, botulism. You know, they're all natural. So we all have lots of positive and wonderful things that come to mind first, and then we have to dig deeper to realize all the bad things in the world are pretty much natural too. So it's not surprising that giving a choice between a natural product and an unnatural product, we will choose the natural one every time. And if you choose the unnatural one, it's because you're ignoring what you feel is the one you should choose. So again, we need to recognize our own biases in order to talk to others about theirs. And so really the biggest threat to the future is not agriculture. It's our inability to work together, to apply solutions to the problems we all face. We know that. How do we talk to each other in a better way? And part of that begins with you, because all of you need to become better storytellers. We all do. Politicians, scientists. We need to find a way of telling our story. And I found when I talk to scientists, they all have a really great story. And yet they often start the conversation by, and the results of my research using the backbone vector, and you just lost everybody. So how do we start? Well, we need to start by personalizing. We need to tell people where we come from. Why do you do what you do? We need to acknowledge people's concerns. In 13 years at the State Department, I never once met a person who was anti-science. I met a lot of people who did not trust the government and didn't trust big business, but they all love science. Imagine the conversation. You're anti-science, which tells me you're an idiot, but I'm open to a conversation. That doesn't really go as well as you might imagine. We need to understand that just because somebody's worried about something we don't think they should worry about doesn't mean they're not worried. It doesn't make them lying. We need to find ways of connecting with them, because we all agree that there are impacts of agriculture in terms of land and water and climate and all of these things. So we agree on so much, there's plenty of room to connect. And that's the only way we can build trust. And it's only when you have trust that you can talk about science. A few years ago, I was talking to the American Meat Science Association, and there are about 1,000 meat scientists in the room. It was as exciting as it sounds. And I told them, if people don't trust you, science doesn't matter. And if people do trust you, science doesn't matter. Stop telling people what you do and tell them why you do it. If people get the why, they generally don't care about the what. If a friend asks you if something is safe and you say yes, and here's 1,000 research papers explaining it, they don't need to read those papers. And if somebody who doesn't trust you says, I disagree with you, and you say there's 1,000 research papers that explain why I'm right, they're not going to read your research papers either. So there's really no situation in which trust or which science trumps trust. Now I'm going to talk about some examples in terms of how to frame conversations. Have any of you heard of pink slime? Back in 2012, there was a woman in Texas who was concerned about this lean, finely textured beef, which was removed from the bones and then used to be put back into hamburger and to make it leaner, and this was ending up in hamburgers in school lunches. And so she started a petition to get this pink slime out of the schools. And within a month, 3 of the 4 companies producing this product, the plants were shut down. This issue was framed around health and safety. Now, about a year later, there was a pop-up restaurant in New York called Wasted. And this was a high-end restaurant. They got 20 chefs together to produce food items using the food scraps that would normally go into the trash bin. And they charged people $100 a plate for the privilege of eating trash. People loved it. They ate this up, literally. Lots of articles written about how wonderful it was that sustainability was becoming part of the food system. They must have saved 1,000 pounds of food waste because it was framed around sustainability. On the other hand, if we don't use that lean, finely textured beef as part of our food and we throw it into the waste piles, that's between 400 and 700 million pounds of food a year. That's almost twice the food waste of the country of Belgium in a given year. And all of that is done, and they give you cheaper food. So you get leaner food, cheaper food, and we avoid adding 2 countries of waste. That sounds pretty sustainable to me. It's the story we tell. How do we frame a conversation in order to make people understand the issues at hand, the choices and the consequences? In the US, we throw away over 48 billion pounds of food a year, so it's a pretty big problem. The 3 most wasted food items in the United States are bread, potatoes, apples. You may know about the Simplot innate potato, which has reduced browning. If we can reduce by 10 or 15% the potatoes that are lost, that could have a huge impact on food loss. I mentioned earlier the Arctic apple from Okanagan Specialty Fruits. It's coming to stores in the fall. If it's successful, that again could have a big impact on how people think about food waste, but it also delivers a consumer benefit. Anybody who has kids and have sent the apple slices to school and gotten the brown slices back knows it would be nice if they would just eat them. So how do we deliver products that people want and love and need? That will change the conversation. So if we were to talk about fisheries, 90% of all fisheries are at risk or in decline. And yet we need to nearly double the amount of seafood that's being consumed by 2050. That's a pretty big challenge, and yet aquaculture has its limitations in terms of impact on the environment. That's where things like the Aqua Bounty salmon might come in. They're all done in recirculating aquaculture systems, reusing 99.97% of the water. We need to find better ways of doing it. We can't just do more of what we've done. It doesn't work to grind up fish and feed it to fish if you're running out of fish. We need innovation. So if we went back to 1970 or 1969 when the population bomb came out, people were very worried back then about population growth. And in this book, it advocates that we stop sending food aid to places like Africa, India, and Pakistan, and we just let the people die. That it's better to let it happen quickly than to just perpetuate a problem until it becomes an even bigger crisis. Well, obviously that billion people didn't die, and that's because the Green Revolution was already well on its way. By 1970, Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize for his contributions. And it was because of better science and technology that that crisis was averted. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't impacts of the Green Revolution on the environment and for people, but I definitely put 1 billion people saved in the plus column. So people are still worried, though, about the population today and the population growth. And yet, if you went back to 1950, the average woman had 5 children. In the developing world, it was 7 or 8. By 2050, it'll be about 2. That's below replacement rate. According to the Swedish statistician Hans Rosling, who died a couple months ago, the year 2014 was the year of peak child. The number of children born in 2014 was the most children that will ever be born in a given year throughout human history. It's all downhill after this. So you may be wondering, how can you go from 7 to 9 billion people if you're having fewer children? Good question. It's because people are living longer. This is a good news story. It means that many of us will still be there in 2050. I put that in the plus column. But it also means that after 2050, population growth slows down dramatically. Today, we're adding 1 billion people every 12 years. That is a tremendous strain on our system. But after 2050, we're going to add 1 billion people every 25, 30 years. We've done that before. So the challenge we have is to get to 2050 without cutting down our forest and without draining our rivers, lakes, and aquifers. Because if we do, in many ways, we're good forever. In 2050, if we continue to produce productivity growth, continues, for the first time in human history, we will not need more food. All of the productivity gains of agriculture, for the first time, will go to reducing the footprint of agriculture. Remember, between 1980 and 2011, we used 50% less water to produce a bushel of corn. Well, imagine if between 2050 and 2100, we used 50% less water to produce a bushel of corn. That means we could feed everybody in 2100 using less water than we do today. We could grow all of our food organically in 2100, or we could take all of South America out of production. We will have choices in a way that we do not today. There's a tremendous opportunity. But the next 35 years are not just the most important 35 years there have ever been in the history of agriculture. They're the most important 35 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. And that's why this moment is so important, and the work you do is so important. But it requires that you be worthy of the public's trust more than the science that you do in your lab. I hope that you will participate in the conversation because it's the only difference we can all make. Thank you.